Two heartfelt reunions captivated us throughout this episode, but in between all that were the finer details defining this brand new adventure. I'm talking the labyrinth, its monsters, and the way Paul and his party approached them, all the way to the city of Rapan and how it became like this. They're the enriching elements of Mushoku Tensei's lore that further brings to life an already well-developed story. So, while I will go deeper into how exactly Rudy's reunions went, there's quite a bit more to be said about the world around him too. Specifically the labyrinth, the danger within, and the party Rudy will be challenging it with. Before I get started though, there's only 3 weeks left to secure these amazing designs from the Mushoku Tensei inspired New Beginnings collection and a week left for the Tensura inspired Genesis tee. I know I mentioned them in my last videos, but I just want to shout them out again since the demand for them has actually been amazing. They are one-time drops which probably won't release again though, so if you like the way they look and are in the market for more subtle anime-inspired fashion, I promise the quality of these is something you won't be disappointed in. Just check out mugenproject.com to see the collection, or if you want a chance to win one, I'll be giving one away to those who follow the Instagram. The winner for that will be decided on stream on Sunday. But anyway, episode 44, Into the Labyrinth, covering chapters 1 to 4 from volume 12 of the light novel. To start things off with a bit of lore, Rapan wasn't always the most prominent city in Begarit. Before it was just a small oasis, but after a chain reaction of events, it had become this bustling hub for fame-seeking adventurers. What particular series of events caused it to take off then? Well, it all stems back to how these massive bones got here. You see, this was once a behemoth causing havoc in the area up until the North God Kalman came and defeated it. I know I said no person had ever witnessed one being slain before, but for a powerful warrior who's defeated an immortal demon king and dragons alike, a simple behemoth was probably nothing for him. So, Kalman came, feasted on the behemoth, then left, and what was left behind was nothing but a rotting carcass, one that would eventually attract all sorts of monsters. Of those, ants were a good number of the monsters that had come to feast too, and it was their tunnels that would create the numerous labyrinths surrounding Rapan. They had come in droves to take part in what was essentially free food, then created nests nearby so that they could continue to take part. The thing about monsters eating the flesh of other stronger monsters though is that the resulting offspring will usually be mutated. So these ants who had an endless supply of food from the strongest monster in the desert were now giving birth to mutated kin who would also eat the behemoth flesh. Continue this cycle for a few more generations, and the expansive nests which now spread across the area as the labyrinths we see today also became home to powerful mutated offspring. It was the #1 attraction for adventurers across the world. Each labyrinth was a potential treasure trove of riches, and the fact there were so many meant adventurers could tackle multiple. It was the perfect place to either get rich quick or come face to face with tragedy. Now, Rudy wasn't so sure that the monster meat theory was true or not, but it did make sense with regards to the demon continent. You see, there monster meat was the only thing to eat, and it just so happened that a higher rate of strong people were born there. This made Rudy wonder if his child would turn out freakishly strong because of that, since he himself had eaten so much monster meat when he was traveling there. In any case, a short walk would bring Rudy and AniNews to the guild, and it was here that he would find Geese struggling to find help to save Roxy. The guy he was talking to was supposedly some really strong adventurer, but no matter what Geese offered, it wasn't enough to face the certain death which came with traversing the Teleportation Labyrinth. He had made comments about it already being a month, which was the first hint Geese wasn't referring to Zenith. Geese was still adamant about at least finding Roxy's remains, but once again, Budget Otar said no. The reason I'm reiterating such a point is because the desperate expressions Geese was making was far different from the ones that Rudy was familiar with. Rudy didn't even know that such a face was possible for him, but according to AniNews, that was actually more his standard look. It seemed whatever time Rudy spent with him back in the forest was actually just Geese trying to act more mature for him. Geese would then bring Rudy to Paul, and what Rudy was expecting was a Paul similar to how he was back in Millis. A broken man frustrated to no end, running away from his problems via bottles of alcohol. What he saw was instead a person far more tame, but deep in Paul's eyes was nothing but emptiness. He was this hollow shell in which all emotion was absent. Sure, he was going through the motions and asking Rudy how he was doing, but the way he did just seemed lifeless. It was a pitiful display that made the entire journey worth it already. Even if Paul's spirit was broken for good, Rudy was going to do everything he could to make things better. He truly believed that he could fix everything. It was as soon as Rudy had mentioned his child, though, that life immediately returned back to Paul's eyes. Whatever concerns Rudy had before were seemingly unwarranted since Paul was actually just half asleep. He had thought the Rudy in front of him was nothing but a dream, thus the distant question and answers. Paul would then ask Rudy about his life right there and then, and Rudy would recount everything up until his marriage. The thing about a conversation like that, though, was that there was a constant fear that Paul would react similarly to last time. Unless he spoke super objectively and chose his words carefully, Rudy was worried Paul might have another one of his jealousy-driven outbursts. Hiding his happiness turned out to be a bit more difficult than Rudy imagined, though, since the more he spoke of his time in Renoa, the more he realized he had nothing but good memories there. There were certainly times when things were tough, but as he remembered all that happened with Sylvie and everyone else, he truly believed he was having the time of his life there. So much so that hiding that fact was just impossible. It was once he finished that Rudy was expecting a stern scolding, but instead Paul simply responded with an apology. He truly felt remorse for removing Rudy from his life this way. This definitely came as a surprise, since Rudy was sure the implication of him sleeping with someone while Paul couldn't would 100% trigger at least some sort of reaction. I mean, Paul did promise to wait until he saved Zenith, so Rudy couldn't even imagine the pain of not doing it for over 6 years now. That's when he found out he did get it on with Lilia once though, but the reason for that was simply because they were attacked by a succubus. A reasonable excuse, since I'm sure you don't need me to describe how depraved a lust-driven Paul would be. Yes, they did have a healer capable of detoxification magic, but with Paul acting the way he was, the physical touch necessary to cast such magic would be way too dangerous for her. Lilia would volunteer to take one for the team instead, and that's how the two ended up doing it together. Now, that's not to say that was a bad thing though, since Lilia and Paul are technically officially married too. It's just Paul did promise to wait until he saved Zenith before doing it again. Aside from that, there was a quick mention of Talhand not being affected by the succubus's poison, and that relates to the reason why he was staring at Rudy's ass later. But going back to Paul and Rudy, Paul would actually comment on how Rudy sounded more confident. It was one of the many signs that he had grown, and that was enough to make him cry even more. Rudy would then embrace Paul himself, and as soon as he realized he no longer had to reach to wrap his arms around him, that's when Rudy would start crying too. Their years apart had just become so much more apparent to each other. It was after this that Paul would confront AniNews, but no context behind their beef was given in the novels either. The whole matter was resolved so quickly though that Rudy was starting to wonder if it was actually just something very trivial. Now, to give a bit more context behind the whole Zenith situation, the wording they used to describe it was captured. This was a strange choice since that could imply multiple things, but more than anything, Rudy was confused as to who or what would be holding Zenith captive for 6 long years now. Like, it probably wasn't a person if it was in the depths of the labyrinth, and the notion of it being the labyrinth itself wasn't something Rudy knew was even possible. Supposedly a party that went in mentioned seeing someone who resembled Zenith, but that party hasn't been heard from since the last time they went in. And that was information Geese had acquired almost 4 years ago. The reason they could still continue searching with the hopes that she was alive now was mostly because of the information that Roxy came with. You see, after hearing from Kashirika that Zenith was alive 2 years ago, it was more than likely that she was still alive now. If she was able to survive that 2-year gap between when she went missing and when Kashirika found her, then it's definitely probable she could have gone another 2 years just fine. This was why Geese was so certain they could still find Zenith, despite him being all doom and gloom for the Roxy situation. Talhand would then come in shortly after this, and AniNews would deliver a warning about how Rudy needed to be careful around him. Apparently he stole what men held most dear. Of course, Rudy had no idea what she was talking about, but I'm sure you can make your own assumptions based on the detail with the succubus before. Now, the news about Roxy was actually more shocking than the news of Zenith, since while Rudy had 6 years to mentally prepare for Zenith's potential death, there was nothing which helped him to prepare for that scenario with Roxy. It was an abrupt revelation that left him stunned. Fortunately, he wasn't so naive as to devolve into panic, since while yes, he wanted nothing more than to leave right away and go save her, he knew more than anything the most important step right now was careful preparation. Sure, time was definitely of the essence, but to rush into the labyrinth without any plan whatsoever, well, that could very well be the difference between life and death for Roxy. So, Rudy would confirm the situation as best he could, then reveal the book which would help them adequately prepare. I had talked about this back in episode 5, so I'll include that segment about the book's contents now just in case you forgot about it. The book was a creative non-fiction that told the tale of Animus's exploration of the Teleportation Labyrinth. With the labyrinth housing traps only related to teleportation, the actual traversal of it became rather difficult. It was from what Animus and his companions could find that they were able to narrow the traps down into 3 broad categories. The first was a one-way teleporter that sent people to the same fixed location, the second a reciprocal teleporter that led to a magic circle allowing for teleportation back, then the third a random teleporter which, well, could take you anywhere. All of which had a good chance to send you straight to a pack of monsters since the creatures inhabiting this labyrinth were both intelligent and cunning. Not only did they understand the labyrinth's complex layout, but they also knew where every teleporter would send someone, often waiting at the destination to hunt whoever it was that was using them. In any case, it was after Animus had found a way to determine which teleporters were reciprocal and which were not that he would only use reciprocals to bring himself deeper. The plan itself was working rather fine, but it was a single misstep that would cause him to use a random one by accident. A fatal mistake that would cause him to lose his entire party and one of his arms. Fortunately, he survived, but with no way to defend himself in the labyrinth anymore, he decided to leave the conquering of it to the reader. Thus the reason he had written this book. Now, it was possible this book pertained to a completely different teleportation labyrinth, so naturally it was best to evaluate whether that was true or not. If you're wondering why Geese was the person to do that, well, Rudy wasn't quite sure himself, but it was clear by everyone's reactions that he was the person responsible for this type of stuff. He seemed to be this flex-type member responsible for everything that wasn't battle. This included anything from mapping and directions, all the way to managing supplies, choosing what drops to take, and even how to extract them. He was both the commander and the errand boy, the group's manager, planner, and coordinator. He would even be the one to decide whether it was best to retreat or not. So, given that this was his role, it made sense that he would be the one to sift through the book's information like that. It was while he did that Rudy would ask Paul 4 key questions about the labyrinth. What were the monsters? How many floors were there? What was the interior like, and what were the shape of the teleportation circles? The monsters were divided into 5 main types, and these were giant poisonous tarantulas capable of projectiles, tank-like caterpillars with sturdy defenses, human-shaped mud creatures intelligent enough to cast magic, armored warriors similar to these guys from Elden Ring, then the devouring devil, which was a beast with long limbs and knife-like claws and fangs. There was an unknown number of floors leading to the bottom, but the most reliable rumor was that it was something like 6 or 7. Of course, since no one had actually reached the bottom, the labyrinth's guardian was just as much of a mystery as the depths itself. They did, however, know what enemies to expect on each floor, since the deeper you went, the more dangerous they got. So, floor 1 was only spiders, floor 2 both spiders and caterpillars, floor 3 the mud skulls which exhibited command over the monsters before, floor 4 only mud skulls and armored warriors, floor 5 only armored warriors and devouring devils, then floor 6 devouring devils alone. The reason the labyrinth follows this type of hierarchy is because the first 3 floors were part of those ant nests I had mentioned earlier, and floor 4 and below were ancient ruins that somehow became connected to it. So, whereas the initial floors are complex winding pathways with rooms connected to them, the later floors were more of what you'd expect from a dungeon. Clear paths and hallways with larger rooms branching off from them. Now, the teleporter shape was no different from the one Rudy knew himself, so that only provided confirmation for what Rudy already suspected. It was once that confirmation was made that a proper formation would then be decided upon. Alina Lise would be the party's tank, Paul the secondary DPS alongside Talhand's secondary DPS and the occasional off-tank, then Rudy the primary DPS and primary healer. These 4 would be in charge of combat, and Geese would handle everything else. Talhand's role was a bit more vague than everyone else's though, since while he was an all-purpose fighter capable of close quarters combat, he was also a magician capable of intermediate tier earth magic. That being the case, his position was one in which he could always do both. He would hover around Rudy and cast magic if need be, or step up to the front and join the fight as well. It really just depended on what the circumstances called for. As for Lilia, Viera, and Shiera, their job was to simply house sit. Since Rudy and AniNews were the replacements for them, they were now tasked with making sure the group had somewhere to come back to. An important job that pretty much every large clan had someone do. The preparations were then done mostly by AniNews or Talhand, but if there was ever a time where Rudy felt his knowledge would be helpful, he figured he would only mention it as a suggestion. Perhaps his experience playing roguelike RPGs could actually be useful, but considering the others were all real-life veterans, Rudy figured it was best to leave everything to them. So, the plan as of now was to get to the 3rd floor and rescue Roxy, then retreat immediately after and see if she was good enough to regroup and go save Zenith. It was a fairly straightforward set of objectives that Rudy assumed would become long and complicated. He honestly had no idea how long any of this would actually take. This brings us now to his conversations at night, and aside from Lilia asking about Aisha and Paul talking about his proclivities, there was an interesting cutscene involving Rudy thinking about the man god. He was lying in bed trying to concentrate, and it was as he did that he wondered if this was what the man god wanted all along. I mean, had he not told Rudy to go to Renoa and study teleportation, then he wouldn't have found this book, which would conveniently turn out to be so helpful in challenging the labyrinth. It was clear the man god's words always hid some sort of deeper meaning, and his last conversation was certainly no exception to that. This brought into question why the man god would suggest the ridiculous things that he did, and the only answer Rudy could come up with was that he was purposefully trying to agitate him. It was as if the man god knew Rudy was trying to be rebellious, and as a way to counter that, he did a bit of reverse psychology. This was confirmed by Rudy saying he would have done the opposite regardless of what the man god said, so had he told him to go to Begarit and leave Sylphie instead, then he 100% would have stayed behind and sent someone else. So, now that the man god had shown yet again his words were to Rudy's benefit, it made Rudy think that perhaps the man god just truly enjoyed watching him. He had no clue what was going on in his head, but considering how at every step he's always been incredibly helpful, Rudy could no longer deny the fact that he was genuinely an ally to him. He did after all send him to the one place that had everything he needed to save Zenith. Fast forward now to the day of the rescue, and Rudy's spirit scrolls would turn out to be far more useful than you may think. Not only did it mean that Paul and Geese didn't have to carry torches, but the light was brighter and lasted longer. Even if the user had summoned it with the fraction of the mana that Rudy did, it would still more than likely last the length of an expedition. More than anything, freeing up a hand was invaluable, so these lamplight scrolls could very well put torches out of the market if Rudy wanted to. So Geese had one to himself 10 steps ahead of the group, while the other hovered by AniNews and Paul as they followed behind. The special shoe he wore made identifying his footsteps easier, and the general rule was to follow them precisely. Now, the 1st floor was, as I said, tarantulas, and their innate knowledge of the labyrinth inadvertently identified where traps were. We saw this in this scene here, since the way they avoided it indicated it was a trap. Rookie adventurers would see it as a way to avoid stepping on the spiders, but in actuality it was a one-way ticket to getting teleported. Paul would typically be the one to dispatch these spiders, and the weapons he used were both familiar and unfamiliar. His main hand carried the sword he trained with all the time back in Fatoa, while his offhand was a sword too long to be called short and too short to be called long. It was a completely different type of weapon that Rudy had never seen before. Paul wasn't really using it much to fight at all though, so Rudy wondered if it was just there to look cool or something. Now, AniNews' reveal about Paul being her son was actually something that got way more of a reaction from him. The moment he heard that she was now family, he immediately broke formation, went to Rudy and verified it. The news of Laws being her son came as quite the shock to him. All that stuff aside though, it took 5 hours and 5 teleporters to get down to the 2nd floor. Each teleporter led to a path to another teleporter, and the time it took to get between them was about 1 hour. Occasionally there'd be 2 teleporters side by side, but Geese had marked the right ones beforehand. The 2nd floor brought with it a new enemy, and these iron crawlers worked together with the spiders. The spiders would immobilize their targets from a distance, then iron crawlers would trample them using their 1-ton bodies and heavy defenses. They weren't so tough that Rudy couldn't take care of them, but unlike the spiders, these iron crawlers weren't an enemy Paul could one-shot anymore. They're actually the reason why they couldn't make it very far without Roxy on their team. The iron crawlers were just an extremely bad matchup for them. Now that Rudy was here, things were a whole lot easier, so not only was this their easiest expedition yet, but Tallhand even found himself bored since there wasn't anything for him to do anymore. He was literally on standby while Rudy cleaned up everything. This would lead to him becoming the lookout while everyone was on break, and it was while on break that Geese would talk with Rudy. He wanted to know, based on the rough maps he put together, where Rudy's intuition might think Roxy was. The map showed where they'd been and where they've searched before, so it was based on that Rudy would point to an empty spot east of where they were. A brand new area yet to be searched that Rudy honestly just picked at random. It was a good distance away from the trap that had teleported her, so it seemed like a good place to start rather than searching everywhere. That's when the group would head to floor 3, and almost immediately after entering, he would smell something familiar. It was a presence he would never mistake for anything else, and 100% proof that Roxy was close. That's when the novel switches over to Roxy's perspective, and it actually explains how it is she survived so long. I do believe that's something we'll get at the beginning of next episode though, so right here is a pretty good place to stop. All in all, things do feel a little bit quick, but they're definitely on track to finish the arc and slow down at the more important parts. They also really killed it with Rudy's timely entrance, and that was probably one of my favorite scenes in the series so far. So, I hope you enjoyed hearing more about this episode, and if you did, feel free to leave a like and comment. Don't forget to check out the new Mugen collection too, but for now, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!